An FBI agent pulled a gun on a royal guard right there on sovereign British soil. His badge was in one hand, his firearm in the other. "This isn't your jurisdiction," he said. But neither was the weapon he had pointed at a British soldier. Just 3 minutes later, armed palace units had surrounded the embassy. And that's when the agent realized he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. Want to know exactly how it all went down? First, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's dive in. That October morning carried a sharp chill, the kind that makes you pull your coat tighter and wish you'd brought gloves. Frost clung to the iron railings outside St. James's Palace, each breath turning into little white clouds that vanished instantly. The ancient stone of the building looked freshly scoured by the wind, and even the pigeons moved briskly through the crisp air. Tourists had already gathered behind the rope barriers, phones in hand even though nothing official was scheduled for another hour. But that's the thing about this place, you don't need a formal event to feel like you're standing in front of history. School groups stood in matching scarves. An elderly German couple passed a steaming thermos of coffee between them. A father hoisted his daughter onto his shoulders to help her see above the crowd. And right beneath the central archway stood Lance Corporal Tristan Hale. If you didn't know better, you might have thought he was made of stone. At 28, he looked every bit the soldier strong enough to carry a wounded comrade for miles. He wore the full ceremonial uniform that draws tourists from across the globe, a scarlet tunic, so sharply pressed it looked dangerous, every brass button gleaming like tiny suns. His white belt was as spotless as new snow. His black boots shone like glass, reflecting the gray London sky. His bearskin hat sat at the exact regulation angle, no stray hairs, no slouch. His left hand rested with perfect precision on the hilt of his ceremonial saber. Beneath him stood Ajax, a majestic black stallion with muscles that shifted like liquid metal beneath his polished coat. The horse's ceremonial tack was just as flawless as the rider's attire. Polished brass fittings caught the light, and every leather strap had been oiled to perfection. To the crowd, they were the picture of British tradition, living statues of discipline and elegance. What those tourists didn't know, as they took their selfies, was that the man atop that horse had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan with the household cavalry. He'd held a forward observation post in Helmand province, while mortar shells rained close enough to shower him with shrapnel, close enough that he could taste the dust. He could still remember the smell of credite, and the way the ground used to tremble beneath his boots. There was shrapnel buried so deep in his left shoulder that surgeons had decided it was safer to leave it in. On days like this, when the weather shifted, he could feel it moving under the muscle, a cold, silent reminder of places he tried not to think about. He had held a 19-year-old trooper named Davies. As he bled out after an IED tore through their convoy, Davies had whispered about letters he planned to write to a girlfriend back in Yorkshire, the one who worked at a bakery and made the best scones he'd ever tasted. Hale would end up writing those letters himself, struggling to find words for a kind of grief no manual had ever taught him how to handle. He learned to sleep through rocket attacks, to stay sharp through 48-hour watches where the tiniest lapse in attention could mean the difference between returning alive or coming back draped in a flag. If you knew what to look for, you'd see the clues, the slow, measured breathing of someone who'd trained himself to stay calm when chaos exploded around him. His gaze might have appeared fixed on the ceremonial point ahead, but his eyes never stopped scanning. Decades of instinct told him to watch for what didn't belong, but none of that was visible to the crowd. He didn't talk about his deployments, didn't post war stories online. He didn't carry his service like a badge of honor or drop subtle hints in conversation to the tourists gathered around him. He was just another part of the spectacle, a piece of red wool and pageantry, as permanent and silent as the stone lions that stood guard over the palace steps. That illusion was about to shatter. Roughly 50 meters away, a sleek black sedan with American diplomatic plates pulled up, wrong on multiple counts, too flashy, blocking the ceremonial route, and notably lacking any escort or official convoy. It hadn't been cleared through the proper channels. Out stepped Agent Marcus Webb. If you'd seen him on any American street, you'd have immediately pegged him for what he was: federal law enforcement, and not the kind with a friendly smile. He was in his mid-30s, built like a former linebacker who now spent more time behind a desk than in a gym. His charcoal gray suit looked custom-tailored and expensive. The tie was knotted with military-level precision. His shoes were polished to regulation black, and his mirrored sunglasses projected nothing but control and irritation. Webb had only been stationed at the U.S. Embassy for 3 weeks, supposedly as part of some vague joint security evaluation that no one had real information about. But from the way he carried himself, it was clear he hadn't come to fill out forms or sit through briefings. He moved like a man who used authority the way others used weapons. His presence screamed credentials, dominance, and a short fuse. That morning, he was already agitated. Something about a security briefing that hadn't gone the way he wanted. Something to do with enhanced protocols and diplomatic sensitivities his supervisor had tried to explain, but he clearly had no patience for. Webb was used to throwing around authority like it meant something because in the places he'd worked, it usually did. He'd spent 15 years busting down doors in cities like Detroit and Minneapolis, where problems were handled with force, not formality. All this British pageantry, to him, it felt like theater, slow, ornate, and utterly inefficient. He'd been watching Hale for 10 minutes, and that soldier's perfect stillness was starting to irritate him. Maybe it was the way tourists lowered their voices around the guard, whispering as if they were inside a cathedral rather than standing on a public street. Maybe it was how even other officials gave the guards a wide berth, like they were sacred relics. Or maybe it was just that Hale's silence felt like judgment, and Webb wasn't the type to take kindly to being judged, especially not by someone he dismissed as a costumed statue. He walked up to Hale and stopped right in front of him, close enough that anyone else would have acknowledged the intrusion. "Agent Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he declared, flashing his badge. "I need you to shift position. We're running a security assessment, and you're blocking a critical sight line." Hale didn't move. His gaze remained fixed, expression unchanging, a statue in scarlet. Webb frowned. "You hear me, soldier?" "Nothing." "That's still nothing." From behind the barrier, a Scottish woman's voice piped up. "He's not allowed to move, is he, dear?" Another answered. "That's the whole point. They're famous for it, like statues." Webb's jaw tightened, getting corrected by civilians. That always got under his skin. "I'm not asking you to break into song and dance," he snapped, stepping in even closer. "Just move aside for 5 minutes so we can sort this security issue out." Hale didn't flinch. If anything, his posture seemed to grow even more precise, an embodiment of unyielding discipline. "What's the matter?" Webb raised his voice, sneering. "Battery die in your costume?" A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd, but the atmosphere had shifted. This wasn't playful anymore. It was tense. Webb took another step forward, now fully invading Hale's personal space. "You know what I think," he said, voice dripping with disdain. "I think you people stand around playing dress up because you couldn't handle a real uniform." Still nothing from Hale, but his left hand, resting on his saber's hilt, tensed briefly, then eased. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but one that suggested enormous restraint. From the crowd, a father holding his daughter's hand spoke up. "Officer, he's just doing his job." Webb spun around, face flushed. "And I'm doing mine, sir. Unless you want to explain to your daughter why Daddy got arrested for interfering with federal business, I'd suggest keeping your opinions to yourself." The man stepped back, clutching his daughter protectively, but the girl didn't look away. She stared at Hale with wide, confused eyes. "Daddy," she whispered. "Why is the American man being mean to the soldier?" Her father had no answer. Webb turned back toward Hale, something sharper now simmering beneath the surface. At this point, it wasn't about security anymore. It had become a power play, and only one man seemed to know he was playing. "You really think you're something special, don't you?" Webb sneered, his voice thick with contempt. "Standing there like a statue while real law enforcement does actual work." He jabbed a finger toward Hale's chest. He didn't make contact, but the gesture was close enough to provoke a reaction, except none came. "I bet you wouldn't last 10 minutes on a real beat," Webb spat. "Try dealing with real criminals instead of standing around posing for tourist photos." A teenage girl had started recording, sensing something serious was unfolding. "You know what?" Webb continued, voice rising. "I don't think you can even hear me. You're so far up your own ceremonial nonsense. You've forgotten what it means to be a human being." The crowd had fallen silent, phones were up, but there was no laughter now, only tension. Webb stepped even closer, now nearly brushing against Hale's polished breastplate. "I've dealt with terrorists more responsive than you," he growled. "At least they had the courtesy to shoot back." Ajax, the black stallion beneath Hale, snorted loudly. His ears flicked back. He sensed the shift. Animals always did when violence was near. Webb noticed and gave a nasty smirk. "Oh, what's this? Your boyfriend going to protect you now? That how backup works here?" Then his hand moved to his jacket. At first it looked casual, maybe adjusting his coat, maybe reaching for his phone, but the motion was too deliberate, too smooth. His fingers slid to the edge of his jacket and pulled it slightly open, revealing the black leather strap of a shoulder holster underneath. The crowd froze. Someone gasped. A child began to cry. You could feel the fear ripple outward, like a wave tightening across the square. Still, Hale didn't move, not a blink, not a breath out of rhythm. Webb's hand kept moving, now with intention. He slid it inside his jacket and gripped his service Glock. 15 years in the field had made the motion second nature. The response from the crowd was immediate. Gasps turned into screams. People dropped behind benches. Parents grabbed their children and scrambled for cover. An elderly woman fumbled, her purse coins scattered across the cobblestones. But Webb didn't raise the weapon fully. He held it low, at an angle visible, but not pointed. It was the classic intimidation move, a threat without officially crossing the line. Final warning, he said, voice cold and clipped. Step aside. I need access to that building. You are going to move. Ajax snorted again, his powerful body quivering with barely restrained energy. He could smell the tension. He could feel the danger. But he didn't move. He was trained better than that. And Hale? He didn't budge. Not even with a loaded firearm just feet away. Not when children were crying behind him. Not when instincts told him to act. He remained absolutely still, an unshakable pillar of duty. As if the threat didn't exist. As if Marcus Webb didn't exist. Drop the weapon, someone shouted from the crowd. But it wasn't the police. It wasn't security who spoke next. Just a bystander, someone with more guts than caution. He's got a gun. A woman's voice rang out, loud, sharp, and shaking with fear. More screams followed, this time carrying real panic. But no one ran, because even in the grip of terror, everyone there understood. They were witnessing something historic, something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. Webb looked around and saw the chaos he'd caused. Phones pointed at him from every direction. Faces stared back, some horrified, some mesmerized, and for a moment, just a fleeting instant, a flicker of doubt crossed his expression. Then he turned back to Hale, still seated high on Ajax, still perfectly still, and the doubt froze into something colder, more defensive. All this, Webb muttered, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. He adjusted his stance, feet now planted wider. His pistol rose just slightly, not aimed, not yet, but higher, readier. A threat made all the more dangerous by his belief that he was the only person in that square with true authority. Ajax took a single, deliberate step forward, not startled, not tense, controlled. It was the kind of movement that only comes from deep, drilled in training, the kind that turns instinct into precision. Hale's grip on the reins tightened ever so slightly, just a fraction, the only sign he was even aware of what was happening. But that subtle gesture was enough. It sent a ripple through the ceremonial square like a stone dropped into still water. Across the palace complex, in corners tourists never see and staff rarely visit, silent alarms began to chime. Not dramatic sirens or flashing lights like in the movies. Just a quiet, unmistakable tone, the kind that means only one thing. A royal guard is in immediate danger. And when that happens, centuries of military protocol respond without hesitation. Webb never saw it coming. The first sign was a low vibration, like the stones beneath their feet were humming. Then, the sharp clunk of vehicle doors slamming shut in synchronized rhythm. And next, boots, heavy, fast, precise, dozens of them, moving across cobblestones with the kind of exact timing that only comes from thousands of hours of drilled coordination. These weren't ordinary officers. This was something else. From multiple directions, black Range Rovers emerged, silent, sleek, and serious. No sirens, no flashing lights, just presence, controlled, professional, intimidating. To the untrained eye, they looked like ordinary vehicles. But those who knew, those with military experience, recognized the subtle markings. These meant business, serious business. The first vehicle stopped exactly 20 meters away. The second blocked access to the American embassy. The third closed off the escape route. Then the doors opened. Out stepped the armed palace response unit. Clad in black tactical gear. Weapons at the ready, but held with that quiet confidence of people who don't need to posture. Their faces gave away nothing. No anger, no nerves, just focus. They moved like water flowing downhill, calm, relentless, and unstoppable. What made the response unit truly intimidating wasn't just their gear or their training. It was their silence. No shouting, no theatrics, no barking of orders. They simply took their positions around the ceremonial square with the quiet ease of professionals who had drilled for this moment hundreds of times before. Webb turned slowly in place, finally grasping the scale of what he had walked into. "Drop your weapon." The voice came clear, not loud, not aggressive, just calm and commanding. "Place your hands above your head." The speaker stepped into view. Captain Hannah Ree. She emerged from behind the lead vehicle with a natural authority that made even the bystanders instinctively stand taller. Mid-40s. Steel gray eyes. Dressed in an immaculate Royal Military Police uniform. The green and gold insignia on her shoulder left no question she was someone with real command. Webb spun. Weapon still raised but now visibly trembling. "I'm a federal agent. I have diplomatic immunity. You can't." "You drew a firearm on a serving member of the British Army," Captain Ree interrupted, her tone as flat and unwavering as stone, "while he was carrying out ceremonial duties on Crown property. That makes this our jurisdiction." She stepped closer, hands clasped behind her back, utterly unfazed by the weapon in his grip. "Sir, you have 10 seconds to place that weapon on the ground and surrender yourself into our custody. If you fail to comply, my team is authorized to use whatever level of force is required." Webb's eyes darted around. Desperate, he searched for backup that wasn't coming, escape routes that had already been cut off. Every direction he turned, another black-clad soldier stood with perfect posture and tactical readiness. They had boxed him in completely. "This is insane," he muttered, voice drained of the bravado he'd carried earlier. "I didn't even do anything. I barely threatened him. Look at him, he's fine." Captain Ree cast a glance at Hale, still mounted on Ajax, still facing forward, motionless, untouched by the chaos unraveling around him. "Yes," she said softly, "he is fine. Because he's been trained to remain fine even under conditions far more extreme than an agitated American with a handgun." She let that settle before continuing. "The question now, Agent Webb, is whether you're smart enough to recognize that you've already lost this confrontation before it becomes something that ends not just your career, but your freedom." Webb's hand began to shake harder. The gun felt impossibly heavy now, the kind of weight that doesn't come from steel, but from consequences. Around him, tourists stood silently, not a word, just 100 recording phones capturing every second of what was clearly about to become either a peaceful surrender or something far worse. Then a child's voice broke the tension. It was the same little girl from before, the one who had asked why the American man was being mean to the soldier. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging her mother's sleeve, "is the bad man going to jail now?" Her mother looked down at her daughter, then back toward the ceremonial square, watching history unfold. "Yes, sweetheart," the mother said firmly, just loud enough for those around her to hear. "He is." And somehow, those simple words, calm, clear, and maternal, carried more weight than any badge Webb could flash or law he could cite. Everyone present, tourists and guards, children and adults, British citizens and foreign visitors, felt the same thing. They weren't just witnessing a confrontation, they were watching justice unfold. Not the courtroom kind, not the kind with judges and verdicts, but the raw, unmistakable kind that appears when someone crosses a line that should never be crossed and gets stopped. Webb looked at the crowd surrounding him. He saw it in their eyes: contempt, pity, and finality. There was no path forward now that didn't end with him in handcuffs. His fingers uncurled, the pistol clattered to the cobblestones, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He raised his hands slowly above his head, his shoulders sagging under the sudden and overwhelming weight of accountability. "I surrender," he said softly. Two members of the Armed Palace Response Unit stepped forward, movements calm and deliberate. They zip-tied his wrists behind his back, retrieved his firearm and badge, and conducted a swift but thorough search for any additional weapons or devices. Throughout the entire process, Webb kept glancing at Hale, still mounted, still motionless, still gazing forward like nothing had happened. He didn't even flinch. Webb muttered to one of the soldiers, his voice touched with something that might have been awe if it weren't so bitter. "I had a gun pointed at him, and he didn't even blink." The officer gave him a brief look, then cast a glance back at Hale before responding. "That's not a bug," the officer said quietly as he guided Webb toward one of the black vehicles. "That's a feature." As they approached the waiting SUV, Captain Ree fell into step beside them, her pace calm, her tone precise. "Agent Webb," she said, using that particular kind of voice that military officers reserve for words they want remembered. "You came here today thinking authority came from your badge, from your gun." You looked at him. She gestured toward Hale, still a perfect image of discipline atop Ajax, and thought his uniform made him weak. "You thought yours made you strong." She paused. Let that settle in. But real authority, the kind that truly matters, doesn't come from what you carry. It comes from what you can endure. Her voice lowered, deliberate, and today, you learned the difference between having power and being powerful. Webb didn't answer. He couldn't. Not because he was out of words, but because somewhere deep beneath the embarrassment, the anger, and the fractured ego, he knew she was right. They loaded him into the back of the lead Range Rover, and as the convoy began to pull away, something remarkable happened. The crowd began to clap. It started with one person. An elderly man visiting London with his wife began to clap. A veteran himself, judging by his upright stance and the small pin on his lapel. His applause wasn't for the arrest or the spectacle. It was for something deeper. Others followed. The mother with her daughter, the Japanese tour group, the Scottish couple who had been sipping coffee. Even the teenager who had filmed the entire incident lowered her phone and joined in. They weren't applauding violence. They weren't celebrating the confrontation. They were acknowledging something far more rare and far more powerful. They were honoring the quiet strength of a man who had faced down a loaded firearm without flinching. A man who had trusted his training, his purpose, and the institutions behind him, even when every instinct must have screamed at him to react. Lance Corporal Tristan Hale didn't acknowledge the applause. He didn't nod, didn't shift, didn't offer the slightest sign that he'd even noticed, because that's not what he was there for. He was there to stand guard, to represent something greater than himself, to serve as a living symbol of a tradition that had endured for centuries, built on the belief that some things are more important than recognition, comfort, or even personal safety. As the convoy carrying Agent Webb disappeared into the distance and the crowd slowly began to thin, people left the ceremonial square with more than just photos or tourist memories. They left with a story about dignity under pressure, about choosing discipline over ego, about the profound difference between making noise and making a statement. That night, the teenage girl who had captured it all uploaded the footage with a simple caption, "Today I learned what real courage looks like." The video would go viral within hours, but the comments wouldn't be filled with outrage or mockery. They'd be thoughtful, reflective. People would share stories of restraint, of grace under pressure, of how quiet strength can often be the loudest kind. Agent Marcus Webb would spend the rest of that day in a holding cell, facing questions from embassy officials, military investigators, and diplomatic authorities, trying to piece together how a routine security check spiraled into an international embarrassment. By sunset, his career would be effectively over, his credentials revoked, his reputation in ruins, all because of 30 minutes of poor judgment and wounded pride. But Lance Corporal Tristan Hale, he remained exactly where he had been all along, still as stone, strong as steel, silent as the centuries he stood for. Ajax, his black stallion, shifted slightly beneath him, muscles loosening now that the danger had passed. But he too remained in perfect position, aware, like all good animals are, that things had returned to normal. Later that afternoon, flowers began to appear near the ceremonial barrier, left by visitors who had heard what happened. By evening, the base of the ceremonial barrier had transformed. Dozens of flowers had been laid carefully along the edge, small tributes from those who had heard the story and wanted to show respect. Handwritten notes from children, thank you. Cards from tourists, simple gestures in response to something extraordinary. Later that day, the palace issued a brief statement. It confirmed that an incident had taken place, but offered no details beyond the fact that a foreign national had been arrested for threatening a ceremonial guard. The American embassy released its own response, expressing regret and promising a full investigation. But none of that mattered much to the people who had been there, because they had already seen what real strength looked like. They had witnessed tradition defend itself, not with aggression or retaliation, but with unshakable calm, with presence, with the kind of quiet certainty that can't be faked. As the afternoon light faded into that warm golden hour that turns London into a watercolor, the crowd still stood at the ceremonial square. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. They weren't just tourists anymore. They were witnesses. They had seen a man threatened with a loaded weapon and refused to flinch. They had seen him choose duty over fear, tradition over self-preservation. They had watched dignity win over dominance. And, as Lance Corporal Tristan Hale stood motionless, silent, unbroken in the saddle, those who remained understood something essential about strength. It's not about who shouts the loudest or who wields the biggest threat. It's about who stays standing when standing becomes hard. It's about who refuses to be moved when moving would be easier. It's about the difference between demanding respect and earning it. So completely, even your enemies recognize it. The American had arrived with authority, credentials, and a loaded weapon. The guard had nothing but discipline, and discipline won. So here's the question that matters. When someone tries to break you down, publicly tries to provoke you, humiliate you, drag you to their level, what's the stronger response? Fighting back, or refusing to be moved? In a world driven by instant reactions and outrage, is there still power in silence? In trusting that sometimes the most powerful statement is no statement at all? Let us know what you think in the comments. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you might realize. And if this story gave you a new perspective on strength, on what it means to truly stand your ground, tap the like button. It genuinely helps more than you know. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. We share stories like this every day, stories about the remarkable men and women who protect these ancient traditions with quiet courage. And if you know someone who needs a reminder of what true authority looks like, someone who believes power is about shouting the loudest until people listen, share this video with them. Your next Royal Guard story is already waiting right there on your screen. Click it, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves, again and again, the same quiet truth. Real strength doesn't need to announce itself. It simply stands, and when it does, even the loudest voices in the world suddenly find they have nothing left to say.